The Tunnel Beneath the Lake. My name's Ethan, and I never believed in urban legends. Ghost stories, creepypasta, all that stuff. It's entertaining, sure, but I always figured it was just people trying to scare each other. That was before last summer, before I learned that some stories are more than just legends. It started when my friend Nate told me about the tunnel. We were sitting on the dock at Hollow Lake, passing around a cheap bottle of whiskey. The water was completely still, the surface reflecting the moonlight like a sheet of black glass. It was one of those quiet, humid summer nights where even the crickets seemed too tired to chirp. You ever hear about the old tunnel? Nate asked, his voice low. I shook my head. What tunnel? Nate leaned closer. They built it back in the 50s. A maintenance tunnel under the lake for the water treatment plant. Problem is, the project got abandoned after a bunch of workers went missing. Missing? I scoffed. Sounds like a campfire story. Nate grinned. Yeah, probably, but some of the bodies were found. Or parts of them, anyway. Official reports said industrial accident, but nobody bought that. After a few more people disappeared, they sealed the tunnel up. Supposedly it's still down there under the lake. I rolled my eyes. And I'm guessing you know how to get in? Maybe, Nate said, his grin widening. You in? I should have said no. I should have laughed it off and gone home. But the whiskey was warming my veins, and Nate's cocky smirk pissed me off just enough to make me want to prove him wrong. Let's go, I said. We rowed across the lake in Nate's old aluminum canoe, the paddles cutting through the water with slow rhythmic splashes. The moon was hidden behind a thin veil of clouds, and the further we got from shore, the darker it became. My stomach was already tightening with unease, but I forced myself to keep going. About halfway across the lake, Nate pointed to a cluster of rocks jutting out of the water. We tied the canoe to one of them and climbed out onto the slippery surface. Nate pulled out a crowbar and started working at a rusted metal grate set into the rocks. After a few minutes, the grate groaned and fell inward with a loud clang that echoed across the water. There it is, Nate said, shining his flashlight into the hole. A stone passageway sloped downward into blackness. This feels like a bad idea, I muttered. Come on, Nate said. Don't tell me you're scared. I wasn't about to let Nate call me a coward, so I climbed in after him. The tunnel was narrow and wet, the walls slick with algae and condensation. The air was thick with the smell of stagnant water and rust. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, but the light seemed to dissolve just a few feet ahead of us. We walked for what felt like hours. The deeper we went, the colder it got. My breath fogged in the beam of my flashlight. I was about to suggest turning back when we heard it, a sound like someone breathing. Did you hear that? I whispered. Nate nodded. Yeah. We stood there, frozen, listening. The sound of breathing grew louder, echoing through the tunnel. Hello, Nate called out. The breathing stopped. And then we heard the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from up ahead. Nate aimed his flashlight down the tunnel. The beam illuminated the shape of a man standing about 30 feet away. His skin was pale and mottled, his eyes wide and glassy. He was wearing a tattered work uniform, something out of the 50s. Sir? Nate called. Are you okay? The man didn't respond. He just stood there, swaying slightly. Nate, I said, stepping back, we need to go. Nate took a step forward. "Hey, we can help you." The man's head jerked unnaturally to the side. Then he started walking toward us, ... No, not walking, gliding. His feet weren't touching the ground. "Run!" I screamed. We turned and sprinted back the way we came, our flashlights swinging wildly. The sound of footsteps followed us, impossibly fast. I risked a glance over my shoulder and saw the man floating just a few feet behind us, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. We reached a fork in the tunnel, and Nate made a hard left. I followed, slipping on the wet floor. My knee hit the ground hard, sending a bolt of pain up my leg. "Come on," Nate shouted. We scrambled through, slamming the door shut behind us. I heard the sound of metal scraping against metal as the thing on the other side clawed at the door. We ran up the tunnel, and suddenly we were climbing out through the grate. We pulled ourselves onto the rocks, gasping for breath. Behind us, the tunnel entrance sat dark and still. Nate sat back, his hands shaking. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, "but I'm not coming back to find out." We got back in the canoe and paddled toward the shore. Neither of us spoke. When we reached the dock, we sat there for a long time, just staring out at the water. A week later, I saw an article in the local paper. 2 fishermen had gone missing on the lake, vanished without a trace. Nate and I never talked about the tunnel again. He left town not long after. I stayed, but I don't go near Hollow Lake anymore. Sometimes when the night is quiet and the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that sound, the slow, measured breathing, echoing across the water. And sometimes I think I see a pale figure standing at the edge of the lake, just waiting for someone else to be curious enough to go looking. Because some doors once opened never close. The House on Black Hollow Road. My name's Ben, and I've always been fascinated by old houses. The creaking floorboards, the peeling wallpaper, the sense that someone or something might still be lingering there. It's why I took up house flipping as a side hustle. Find a cheap, abandoned house, fix it up, and sell it for a profit. It was a simple plan until I bought the house on Black Hollow Road. It started when my real estate agent called me about a property that had just gone up for auction. A 3-story Victorian manor built in the late 1800s, sitting on 5 acres of forested land. The listing price was suspiciously low, almost too good to be true. "It's a steal," the agent had said. "Needs a little work, but nothing you can't handle." I should have trusted my instincts when I pulled up to the house for the first time. It was surrounded by a tall iron fence, the gate rusted and hanging slightly off its hinges. The house itself was massive, dark red brick covered in ivy, with tall, narrow windows that seemed to watch me as I approached. I stepped out of my truck, crunching gravel beneath my boots. The air felt wrong, heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. Still, the house had potential. I walked up the stone steps and unlocked the front door with the key the agent had left for me. The door creaked open, revealing a grand entrance hall. A massive staircase wound up to the 2nd floor, and the light from my phone's flashlight reflected off a dusty crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The house was colder inside than it should have been. Even though it was the middle of summer, my breath fogged in the air as I stepped inside. "Just old pipes," I muttered to myself. The first few days were uneventful. I cleaned out the debris, stripped the peeling wallpaper, and made a list of repairs. The place was quiet, unnervingly so, but I figured it was just the isolation. Then the noises started. At first it was small things, a soft tapping from the walls, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere upstairs. I chalked it up to mice or raccoons. Old houses make noise. It's part of the deal. But then it got worse. Late one night I was working on restoring the fireplace in the sitting room when I heard the sound of footsteps above me. Slow, deliberate. I froze, listening. I lived alone. No one else should have been in the house. I grabbed a crowbar and made my way upstairs. The hallway was dark, my phone's flashlight barely illuminating the faded floral wallpaper. "Hello?" I called out. No response. I moved toward the end of the hall. One of the doors was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, my breath coming in short gasps. The room was empty, just an old bedroom, stripped bare except for a rusted bed frame and a cracked mirror leaning against the wall. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, a figure, tall, thin, pale, standing directly behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. I backed out of the room, heart hammering in my chest. The figure in the mirror had been wrong somehow. Its face didn't look human, too long, too angular. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I called the real estate agent. Did the previous owner mention anything strange about this place? There was a pause on the other end. Well, the agent said slowly, the house has a bit of history. I gripped the phone tighter. What kind of history? Look, I'm not supposed to talk about this, but the house belonged to the Holloway family. They built it in the 1880s. Old money. Lived there for generations, and they all died, the agent said. All of them. The last Holloway, a man named Richard, killed his wife and 2 daughters in the house before hanging himself from the chandelier in the foyer. That was about 50 years ago. Why didn't you tell me this before? You didn't ask, the agent said. I hung up, feeling sick. That night I woke to the sound of whispering. At first I thought I was dreaming, but then I realized I was awake, and the whispering was real. It was coming from the hallway. I sat up, my heart racing. My bedroom door was open. I swear I had closed it before bed. The whispering grew louder, and I could hear multiple voices now. Low, faint, like the sound of wind through dead leaves. I grabbed the crowbar from under my bed and stepped into the hall. At the far end, a door I knew had been locked since I moved in was now standing wide open. I shone my light into the room. It was a nursery. Old wooden cribs lined the walls, covered in cobwebs and dust, and sitting in one of the cribs was a doll. It was old, cracked porcelain, with black glass eyes and matted hair. The whispering stopped. I took a step back. The doll's head turned toward me. I ran. I sprinted down the hallway and down the stairs. The chandelier above me swayed violently, as though some unseen force was shaking it. The front door wouldn't budge. I yanked on it, but it was like the house itself didn't want me to leave. Footsteps pounded down the stairs behind me, dot, dot. I turned and saw Richard Holloway standing there, or what was left of him. His skin was gray and rotting. His eyes were black pits. His mouth stretched into a horrible grin as he stepped toward me. You can't leave, he said, dot, dot. The glass panes on the windows shattered as the chandelier tore free from the ceiling, crashing to the floor just inches from me. I turned and sprinted toward the back of the house. I found the old storm door leading to the basement and forced it open. I crawled through just as the house began to shake. I ran through the dark, through the woods behind the house, not stopping until I saw the lights of the main road. The house burned that night. I don't know how it happened, but when I drove by the next morning, it was nothing but a charred ruin. But the story doesn't end there. A few months later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a doll, the same one from the nursery. There was a note attached. "We're still waiting for you." I smashed the doll with a hammer and buried the pieces in a field miles away from my house. But sometimes late at night I hear whispering, and sometimes I wake up to find my bedroom door open, even though I'm sure I closed it before bed. I don't flip houses anymore, and I never go near Black Hollow Road, because some houses don't want to be fixed. Some houses don't want to let you leave. And some things once invited and never really leave. The Whispering House. My name's Ethan, and I've always been fascinated by old houses. The more run-down and mysterious, the better. There's just something about the faded wallpaper, the creaky floorboards, and the musty air that makes me feel like I'm touching the past. I guess that's why I didn't hesitate when I got the pay was good, and the owners said they just needed someone to keep an eye on the place while they were away. It sounded perfect, peaceful, a chance to get some writing done and relax in the quiet. I should have known better. The house was massive, much bigger than I'd expected. 3 floors, a sprawling library, and hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. The exterior was weathered stone, ivy creeping up the walls, the windows set deep into the facade like eyes watching the world with quiet malice. The drive up to the house had taken me through miles of dense forest, and by the time I pulled into the long, circular driveway, I couldn't see another building or even a road in any direction, just trees. The owner, a middle-aged man named Mr. Carraway, met me at the door. He was tall and thin, with hollow cheeks and watery gray eyes. His wife, Eleanor, stood behind him, her eyes downcast. Mr. Carraway smiled thinly and handed me a heavy iron key. "The house is simple enough," he said. "The kitchen is stocked. The bedroom's upstairs. You'll find the power breakers in the basement if anything goes out. And, well, if you hear anything at night, just ignore it." That last part made me pause. "What do you mean by that?" "Oh, nothing," he said quickly. "Just old pipes. This house. It's old. Old houses make noises." That was the first red flag, but I was too focused on the easy money to care. I told myself I'd stay one night, and if anything weird happened, I'd leave. I should have left right then. After the Carraways left, I explored the house. It was even larger than I'd thought, full of high ceilings and heavy oak doors. The furniture was antique and well-maintained, but the whole place had a strange vibe. The air was cold, and not just because it was October. It felt wrong. The first night started quietly enough. I made some dinner, settled in front of the library fireplace with a book, and started to relax. Around midnight, I heard the first sound. It was soft at first, a faint whispering sound coming from the ceiling above me. It was so quiet I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. But then it came again, A child's voice, a soft, breathy whisper. "Come upstairs." I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. "Hello?" I called out. Silence. I stood there for a long time, listening, but nothing else came. Finally, I convinced myself it was just the wind or maybe something shifting in the old beams. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The next night, it got worse. I was sitting in the library again when I heard it. This time it was louder, clearer. "Come upstairs." It wasn't just one voice. It was multiple children, their voices overlapping, whispering the same thing over and over. "Come upstairs, come upstairs, come upstairs." I stood, clutching the arm of the chair. My mouth was dry. My hands were shaking. Then I heard something else, a soft thump and another. Footsteps coming from the second floor. My rational mind told me to leave, but my curiosity pushed me toward the staircase. I grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, just in case. My foot hit the first step and the whispers stopped. Dead silence. I forced myself to climb the stairs, my heart hammering so loudly it was hard to hear anything else. The hallway stretched out before me, lit only by the pale moonlight coming through the tall windows. That's when I saw it, a child, a girl in a white nightgown standing at the end of the hallway. She was barefoot, her long blonde hair hanging over her face. She turned toward me slowly, and when her head tilted upward, I saw her eyes, black, hollow. She opened her mouth. Her jaw unhinged in a grotesque way far wider than any human mouth should open. "Come upstairs," she whispered. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The temperature in the hallway plummeted, and my breath came out in white clouds. The girl's head snapped toward the wall, and then, with a sound like tearing fabric, she melted into the darkness. I stumbled back toward the stairs, but the floor beneath me shifted. The walls began to pulse, the wallpaper peeling away to reveal dark, wet stone underneath. The house was changing, and then I heard the footsteps again, more than one set this time. Figures were coming out of the shadows, thin, pale shapes with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. Some wore tattered hospital gowns. Others were dressed in old-fashioned suits and dresses, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. I ran. I barreled down the stairs, the house shaking beneath my feet. When I reached the front door, it wouldn't open. The key twisted in the lock, but the door stayed shut. "Come upstairs," they whispered. "Come upstairs." I pounded on the door. "Let me out." Something cold touched my shoulder. I spun around and saw one of them standing inches from me. His face was withered and decayed, his mouth stretching into a hideous smile. "You can't leave," he whispered. "You're part of the house now." I lunged for the window beside the door and drove the fireplace poker through the glass. It shattered. I pulled myself through the broken frame, feeling glass tear through my clothes and into my skin. I hit the gravel driveway hard. My ankle twisted beneath me, but I forced myself to stand and run toward my car. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The engine roared to life, and I tore down the driveway, not stopping until I was miles away from that place. The Carraways never contacted me. I heard through someone else that the house was sold to another family a few months later. I don't know what happened to them. I never told anyone the full story until now. I barely slept for weeks after that night. The nightmares were constant. The whispers, the faces, the feeling of that cold hand on my shoulder. But the worst part? Sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still hear it. A faint whisper just at the edge of hearing. Come upstairs? And sometimes I think I see her, the girl in the white nightgown, watching me from the corner of my room, waiting for me to come upstairs. The Cave of Lost Echoes. My name is Ryan, and I need to tell you about what happened last summer. We were just a group of normal teenagers looking for an adventure, something to kill the boredom of small-town life. We thought we were invincible, thought nothing could really touch us. But we were wrong. It started with Jack's idea. It was always Jack's idea. Jack was my best friend since we were kids. He was the leader, the one who pushed the limits, who always had a new scheme or plan to keep us entertained. Then there was Emily, Jack's girlfriend. Sharp, funny, and always the smartest person in the room. Connor and Lacey rounded out the group. Connor was Jack's cousin, big, athletic, kind of a meathead but loyal to a fault. Lacey was Emily's best friend, quiet, but with a rebellious streak that showed when you least expected it. The five of us had spent the summer hanging out by the lake, sneaking beers from Connor's older brother, and driving around with no real destination. But by August, we were running out of ideas. That's when Jack suggested the cave. I heard about it from my dad, Jack said one evening as we sat on the hood of his car, parked at the overlook above town. It's up in the woods past the old quarry. Supposedly it goes deep, like really deep. So? Connor asked. Jack's eyes gleamed. So, no one's been to the bottom. Emily rolled her eyes. Because it's probably dangerous. That's the point, Jack grinned. I should have known better. Jack had a way of making the dumbest ideas sound like the best plan in the world. Come on, he said. What else are we doing? Sitting around, doing nothing? I'm not going, Emily said. Same, Lacey added. Jack looked at Connor. What about you? Connor grinned. I'm in. Jack turned toward me. Ryan? I hesitated. The thought of crawling around in some dark hole underground didn't exactly sound appealing. But I didn't want to be the only one left out. That's how Jack always got you. Made you feel like you'd miss something epic if you didn't follow him. All right, I said. I'm in. That's how it started. We set out the next morning. Jack's dad had an old set of camping gear we borrowed. Flashlights, ropes, harnesses, helmets. I tried to ignore the fact that some of the equipment looked pretty worn out. Jack drove us out toward the quarry. We parked just off the road and hiked up through the woods for about an hour before we found the entrance. It didn't look like much, just a narrow hole at the base of a rock formation, a gap between the earth and the stone. The opening was dark, cold air seeping from the mouth, like the cave itself was breathing. Jack was already pulling on his harness. Jack, Emily said, arms crossed, this is stupid. Then don't come, he shrugged. No one's forcing you. Connor was grinning as he strapped on his gear. I felt that familiar pull, Jack's contagious energy. He made everything feel like a game, like it was fun. Come on, he said. We'll go down, check it out, and be back before dark, easy. Famous last words, Emily muttered. Jack dropped down first, disappearing into the darkness with a cocky, "See you losers at the bottom." Connor followed next, then me. The rope slid through my gloves as I lowered myself down. The walls of the cave were cold and damp, covered in patches of moss and strange white lichen. My headlamp cast thin beams of light that barely seemed to penetrate the blackness. Below me, I heard Jack's voice echoing up. "Hurry up, Ryan, you're holding up the line." "Shut up," I muttered. I hit solid ground about 15 feet down. Jack and Connor were already unhooking themselves. The floor of the cave was uneven stone, slick with moisture. Ahead, the tunnel stretched out, disappearing into the darkness. "Holy shit," Connor said. "It's huge." Jack was already moving forward. "Come on." I hesitated. There was something off about the place, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But Connor followed Jack without hesitation, so I followed too. We moved deeper. The air grew colder. The walls tightened in places, forcing us to squeeze through narrow gaps before opening up again. The light from our headlamps bounced off jagged stone and dripping stalactites. We were maybe 100 feet in when I heard it, a whisper. I stopped, turning my head. "Did you hear that?" Connor frowned. "Hear what?" "A voice," I said. It sounded like whispering. Jack grinned. "Dude, you're just imagining things." But I wasn't. It came again. Soft, faint, like someone speaking from far away. "Ryan." I spun toward Jack. "You didn't hear that?" Jack's smile faltered. He opened his mouth to say something when suddenly, bang! The ground beneath us shifted. A low, rumbling sound rolled through the tunnel. "Shit," Jack said. "What the hell was that?" Connor shouted. The sound grew louder, a deep grinding, like stone sliding against stone. Then the floor beneath our feet buckled. "Move!" Jack screamed. We ran. The tunnel behind us collapsed with a deafening roar. Dust and debris filled the air. I stumbled, nearly falling. Connor pulled me upright, and we kept running until we reached another chamber, a wide, open cavern with a shallow pool of water at its center. Jack turned, gasping for breath. "Everyone okay?" I coughed, trying to catch my breath. Connor nodded. The tunnel behind us was gone, blocked by tons of rock. "We're trapped," Connor said. "No shit," Jack muttered. I turned toward the cavern. The water was perfectly still, except for small ripples spreading across the surface. A soft sound echoed through the chamber. Dripping, clip, clip, clip. Jack's headlamp swept across the far side of the chamber. The wall there was covered in strange markings, symbols carved into the stone, primitive shapes and lines. Some looked like faces, distorted, screaming faces. "What the hell is this?" Connor whispered. "I don't know," Jack said. His headlamp flickered, casting strange shadows over the carvings, and then the whispering started again. Only now it was louder, clearer. "Ryan." Jack and Connor froze. We all heard it that time. The whispering turned into voices, murmuring, overlapping, a chorus of soft, rasping tones. The water at the center of the cavern began to ripple more violently. A figure stepped out of the shadows on the far side of the chamber. It was tall and thin, with long limbs and dark, wet skin. Its eyes gleamed in the darkness, pale white orbs with no pupils. It smiled, its mouth stretching too wide. It whispered something. I don't know what it said, but it made my chest tighten. My knees went weak. Jack stepped backward. What the fuck is that? The figure's head snapped toward us. Its smile widened, and then it started moving toward us, screamed. Connor grabbed me by the arm. Run. We turned and sprinted toward the nearest tunnel. The thing followed. I could hear it moving, its limbs dragging along the stone floor. We stumbled into the tunnel, panting and gasping. Behind us, the thing's whispering grew louder. Ryan, come back, come back. Jack's headlamp flickered. Then we heard the sound, not whispering, breathing. Loud, wet, and right behind us. The sound of wet breathing was so close I could feel the moisture in the air. My heart hammered against my chest as Connor yanked me down the narrow tunnel, Jack right behind us. Our headlamps bounced violently as we stumbled over jagged rocks and uneven ground. It's still coming, Jack shouted, his voice cracking with panic. I didn't need him to tell me. I could feel it behind us, the cold pressure of its presence, the way the air seemed to hum with wrongness. The whispering was growing louder, overlapping voices bleeding into each other. Ryan, Jack, Connor, the sound of our names being spoken in that twisted, sing-song voice made my stomach drop. Where are we going? I shouted. No idea, Connor said. We rounded a sharp bend, the tunnel splitting into two paths. Without hesitation, Connor veered left, dragging me with him. Jack cursed behind us, but followed. The tunnel narrowed, the rough stone scraping my shoulders as we ran. My foot caught on something, a rock or root, and I went down hard, my hands slamming into the cold, wet ground. Ryan, Connor yelled. I groaned, trying to push myself up. My palms were stinging. Jack skidded to a stop behind me, grabbing my arm and hauling me upright. We have to keep moving. But then the whispering stopped. Complete silence. I felt a pressure in my chest, like the air had been sucked out of the tunnel. My headlamp flickered. Connor's light dimmed. Jack's went out completely. Shit, Jack said, his voice tight with fear. A soft sound drifted through the darkness. A tapping, slow, steady, like fingernails on stone. Connor raised his headlamp toward the far end of the tunnel. That's when we saw it. A shape emerged from the darkness, tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. Its skin was gray, glistening in the weak light. Its eyes, pale white orbs, seemed to reflect the light from Connor's headlamp. It smiled, stretching its mouth far too wide. Run, I whispered. It lunged. We took off, sprinting down the narrow tunnel. I could feel it gaining on us, the sound of its limbs scraping along the stone floor. We burst into another chamber, larger this time with high, sloping walls that disappeared into the darkness above. Patches of pale fungus glowed faintly along the walls, casting the room in an eerie, greenish light. Where the hell are we? Jack gasped. Connor was already scanning the walls. There, at the far end of the chamber, was a jagged opening. Another tunnel, smaller, narrower. It might have been a dead end, but it was our only option. Connor pulled me toward it. Jack hesitated, glancing back toward the tunnel we'd come from. Come on, Connor shouted. Jack ran toward us. We squeezed through the narrow gap, the stone scraping our backs. Jack's foot slipped, and Connor grabbed his arm, yanking him through just as the creature lunged into the chamber behind us. Its pale eyes gleamed in the dim light. It smiled, and then it stepped back. "What? Why isn't it following us?" Jack whispered. I didn't have an answer. I didn't want an answer. We turned and kept moving. The tunnel twisted and narrowed until we had to crawl on our hands and knees. The rock was cold beneath my palms. I could feel moisture seeping through my jeans as I dragged myself forward. "I hate this," Jack muttered. "I hate this so much." Connor's breathing was ragged ahead of me. We crawled for what felt like hours before the tunnel widened enough for us to stand. The air was warmer here, heavier. My headlamp flickered again, then steadied. "Where the hell are we?" Jack said. Connor swept his light across the cavern. The walls were smoother here, almost polished. Strange carvings covered every surface, shapes and symbols etched into the rock. Jack approached one of the carvings. "These are people," he said slowly. He was right. The symbols were humanoid figures, carved in jagged, uneven lines. Some were standing, others were lying down, and some were missing parts. Connor's headlamp settled on the far wall. His breath hitched. "Oh shit." I followed his light. The carvings there were different, twisted shapes with elongated limbs and pale eyes. The figures were surrounding the others, reaching for them with clawed hands. Beneath the carving was a single word etched into the stone. "Echo." Jack shook his head. "What the hell does that mean?" Connor's light swept across the floor, and that's when we saw it. Bones. Human bones, scattered across the cavern floor. Some were old, yellowed, and brittle. Others were fresher. Pieces of torn fabric were mixed among them, faded blue denim, fragments of leather. Jack backed away. Nope, this is messed up." A soft sound echoed through the cavern. Clip. We all turned toward the sound. A dark shape was rising from the floor. It was pulling itself out of the ground. Its limbs were long and thin, its skin glistening with moisture. Its face was wrong, distorted, stretched unnaturally. Its eyes were white. The creature rose to its full height, taller than any human. Its mouth split open into a wide grin, exposing rows of jagged teeth. Jack screamed. Connor grabbed me by the arm and pulled me toward the nearest exit. We scrambled into another tunnel as the thing's limbs scraped against the stone behind. We didn't stop until we reached another chamber. Smaller this time, Connor collapsed against the wall, panting. Jack was shaking, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" Jack gasped. Connor's hands were trembling. I don't know. That thing, it came out of the ground. Jack's eyes were wild. "What the hell is down here?" Connor shook his head. "It's not just down here." Jack frowned. "What are you talking about?" Connor shined his light toward the far side of the chamber. The carvings there were newer, sharper. They depicted more humanoid shapes surrounded by the twisted figures. Connor's voice was low and cold. "They've been watching us." Suddenly my headlamp flickered. Flip, flip. I turned toward the sound. From the far tunnel, something moved. A shape emerged from the darkness. Its eyes gleamed white in the dim light. Its mouth twisted into a smile, and then another shape emerged behind it. Then another and another. Jack stumbled backward. "We need to get out of here." Connor raised his headlamp toward the far wall. Another tunnel, narrow. "We can squeeze through there," Connor said. "Go!" Jack shouted. Connor went first. Jack followed. I moved toward the tunnel, but then I heard it, a voice. Ryan, I turned. The figure stood in the middle of the chamber. Its white eyes gleamed in the dim light. Come back. I stumbled backward into the tunnel. Jack grabbed me. Don't stop. We crawled through the tunnel, the whispering growing louder behind us. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. We emerged into another chamber, larger this time, with a wide slope leading downward. Connor collapsed, gasping for air. Jack was pale, sweat dripping down his face. And behind us, the whispering grew louder. Jack's headlamp swept across the chamber. The slope led to a dark pit at the far end. Jack shook his head. No way. I'm not going down there. Connor's face was white. I don't think we have a choice. The whispering rose to a deafening roar, and then, from the pit, something moved, something big. The whispering swelled, rising into a chaotic chorus that filled the cavern. The voices seemed to come from everywhere, above, behind, and deep within the yawning pit that stretched before us. ... We have to go down there? Jack stammered, his voice barely audible above the noise. We don't have a choice, Connor said grimly. If we stay here... He trailed off, his eyes fixed on the shadowy shapes crawling from the tunnel behind us. ... Figures, pale-skinned things with distorted faces and white, empty eyes were filling the passageway. Their twisted smiles stretched too wide, and their limbs jerked unnaturally as they moved. Go, I shouted. Connor grabbed Jack's arm, and we bolted down the rocky slope toward the pit. The ground became uneven, the stones slick with moisture. My boots skidded dangerously, and Jack nearly lost his footing. Watch the edge, Connor warned. The pit loomed ahead like a gaping wound in the earth. The deeper we descended, the colder the air became. My breath fogged the air in front of me, and the damp stone seemed to sweat beneath my fingers. We reached the edge of the pit, and I realized how deep it really was. The darkness inside was absolute, swallowing the faint glow of our headlamps. The whispering voices drifted up from the depths, distorted and fragmented like a broken radio signal. What now? Jack asked, his voice shaking. Connor scanned the walls. His light caught something, old ropes, frayed and knotted, tied around metal spikes hammered into the rock. Looks like someone's been down there before, he muttered. That's not a good thing, Jack barked. I know, Connor said, tying one of the ropes around his waist. But if there's another way out, it's down there. Wait, Jack grabbed Connor's arm. What if this is what it wants? What are you talking about? Jack pointed toward the pit. The carvings, the whispers. Those things. Maybe they're driving us down there on purpose. Connor's face twisted with frustration. We don't have time to argue. Behind us, the twisted figures were closing in, their pale eyes gleaming. One of them let out a garbled screech, and they surged forward. Connor grabbed the rope and rappelled into the pit. Come on. Jack hesitated, staring at the approaching figures, then grabbed another rope and followed. I barely managed to loop a rope around my waist before one of the creatures lunged at me, a twisted thing with jagged teeth and clawed fingers. I kicked out, connecting with its arm, and stumbled backward over the pit's edge. For a sickening moment, I was falling. The rope jerked tight, and my breath left my lungs in a choked gasp. Ryan, Connor called from below. You okay? Yeah, I coughed. I descended as fast as I could, my fingers burning against the rope. Above, the creatures gathered at the pit's edge, staring down at us. Their pale faces were twisted with amusement, like they knew something we didn't. I didn't like that. We reached the bottom of the pit, landing in a narrow tunnel that stretched on in both directions. The air was damp and stale, carrying the scent of rot and stagnant water. "Which way?" Jack asked. Connor's headlamp flickered, and the whispering grew louder, closer. "Doesn't matter," Connor said. "We keep moving." We pushed forward, the tunnel walls tightening around us. The carvings continued here, distorted shapes with hollow eyes and twisted smiles. I kept my head down, afraid of what I might see if I studied them too closely. That's when we saw it, an old wooden door warped and swollen with moisture. Rusty chains had been hammered across it, but some were snapped and broken. The door itself hung half open, revealing a faint glow inside. "I don't like this," Jack muttered. "I don't either," Connor replied, but he pushed the door open. The room beyond was wrong. The walls seemed to curve and pulse, like they were breathing. Strange symbols had been etched into the stone, and in the center of the room stood a crude altar. Bones, human bones, were piled around it, twisted and arranged in strange patterns. "Oh, God," Jack whispered. The whispering was deafening now, filling the room like a chorus of tormented souls. "We need to keep moving," Connor said, but his voice wavered. "Wait," I said, pointing toward the far wall. There was another tunnel, narrow and lined with sharp stones, but something was moving inside, ... Figures, not like the twisted things we'd seen before, but something worse. These figures were more human, their bodies broken and rotting. Their faces were familiar, hollow-eyed reflections of the carvings on the walls. Those are people," Jack stammered. "No," Connor said, "not anymore." The figures began to crawl toward us, their bones grinding as they moved. Their empty eyes locked onto us, and the whispering rose to a deafening roar. "Run!" Connor shouted. We bolted through the nearest tunnel, the creatures closing in behind us. The tunnel twisted and branched in all directions, but we kept moving, hoping for some sign of an exit. Then we saw it, a sliver of light ahead, a faint flickering glow. "Go!" Connor shouted. We sprinted toward the light. The air grew warmer, the scent of damp earth giving way to fresh air. The whispering faded behind us, ... We emerged from the cave and stumbled into the open air, gasping and trembling. The sky above was tinged with the early morning light, the faint glow of sunrise breaking over the horizon. For a moment we stood in silence, breathing in the cold morning air. Did we make it?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Connor turned back toward the cave entrance. "I think so," he said, but as the first rays of sunlight spilled across the cave mouth, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Deep inside the shadows of the cave, just before the darkness swallowed it whole, a figure was standing there, watching, smiling, and it whispered my name. We made it home. We told our families we'd gotten lost, that we'd wandered the wrong path, that nothing serious had happened. They believed us, but we knew better. The whispers haven't stopped. Sometimes, late at night, I hear them outside my window, faint and distant. Sometimes I'll catch movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow too large to be explained away. And sometimes I wake up with a faint memory of pale eyes watching me from the foot of my bed. The thing in the cave is still out there, and I think it's waiting for me to come back, because whatever we did down there, we set it free. The Hollow Ward. I've been a nurse for 7 years. You'd think after all this time I'd be used to working night shifts. The endless hum of fluorescent lights, the steady beep of monitors, the quiet shuffle of patients' slippers on the tile floor, it becomes white noise after a while. But St. Augustine's Hospital was different. It had a reputation. The old wing, the Hollow Ward, as staff called it, had been closed down for over 30 years. Structural damage, according to the official report. Mold and broken pipes, they said. But anyone who worked here long enough knew there was more to it than that. People whispered about strange occurrences, missing patients, unexplained noises, shadows moving in empty halls. I never put much stock in ghost stories until the night I was assigned to the Hollow Ward. It was supposed to be temporary. Staffing issues, they said. Just one shift to cover a few patients who'd been moved there during renovations. No big deal. I clocked in at 11 p.m. The nurse's station on the main floor was busier than usual, and I caught sight of the head nurse, Carol, waving me over. "We're short-staffed again," she said, handing me a clipboard. "You'll be covering the Hollow Ward tonight." I froze. Why would we even have patients in there? Carol's eyes darted toward the hallway leading to the old wing. "Overflow from the main AA," she said quickly. "Renovations have closed 2 wings, so we've had to use the old floor for temporary cases. Don't worry, it's just 2 patients. Quiet ones." I hesitated. "Can't someone else? We're short." "You're it." I sighed, took the clipboard, and headed toward the Hollow Ward. The entrance was at the far end of the main floor, marked by a pair of heavy double doors. The glass panes were covered in grime, and a battered sign read "Restricted Area." I pushed open the doors, and immediately the temperature dropped. The hallway stretched ahead, long and dimly lit. The walls were lined with cracked tiles, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and bleach. My footsteps echoed unnervingly loud. "Just a shift," I muttered. "Just a few hours." The patients' names were on the clipboard. Room 304 and 307. I checked the map, 3rd floor, east side. Easy enough. I took the old elevator, which shuddered to life with a groan of protest. As I ascended, the lights flickered. My reflection in the tarnished metal walls looked pale and strained. The elevator doors opened onto the 3rd floor, and the hallway stretched out before me in oppressive silence. Click, 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 I froze. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate. "Hello?" I called out. Nothing. Just the soft hum of the hospital's aging ventilation system. "It's just your imagination." Room 304 was the first one on the right. I peeked inside. An elderly woman lay in the bed, her thin form barely a bump under the sheets. Her name on the chart was Marjorie Lewis. She was hooked up to a heart monitor, her breathing shallow. I checked her vitals, adjusted her 4, and whispered, "You're doing fine, Mrs. Lewis." She didn't respond. I turned to leave, and then her hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. I yelped. Her eyes were open now, pale and glassy. "Don't let him in," she whispered. "Mrs. Lewis?" I said, my heart hammering. Her grip tightened, painfully. "He's already here," she said, her voice thin. and strained. I pulled my hand away and stumbled into the hallway, breathing hard. She's confused, I told myself. Delirium. Happens all the time. I moved on to room 307. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, a young man lay motionless on the bed. He was in his 20s, pale, with dark hair matted to his forehead. His chart read Ethan Connors. No history of mental illness. No significant medical conditions. Just a bad case of dehydration and exhaustion after collapsing at work. I adjusted his fore and brushed his hair away from his face. His skin was cold to the touch. His eyes fluttered open. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. I frowned. "You're safe. Just rest, okay?" "No," Ethan said. His gaze was glassy and unfocused. "He knows you're here now." "What are you talking about?" "He's waking up." Suddenly Ethan sat bolt upright, his mouth opening in a silent scream. The heart monitor flatlined. "Oh, God!" I shouted. I grabbed the crash cart and tried to stabilize him, pressing the defibrillator pads to his chest. "Come on." Ethan's eyes snapped open, and I froze. His pupils were pitch black. A terrible smile spread across his face. "He's here." The monitor screeched, and Ethan's body arched unnaturally off the bed. His arms flailed, and the bed frame rattled. Suddenly he collapsed, his body limp. The heart monitor beeped steadily. His eyes were closed again. I stumbled back, shaking. What the hell is going on? I backed into the hallway and heard the sound of footsteps coming from the far end. The elevator at the end of the hall opened with a low chime. A man stepped out. He was tall, dressed in a faded doctor's coat. His face was pale and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and deep-set black eyes. His smile was unervingly wide. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a soft, calm voice. I stumbled back. Who are you?" He took a step closer. His polished shoes made no sound on the tile floor. "I'm the attending physician," he said. "And you? You've wandered too far." Behind him, the lights flickered and died. The hallway plunged into darkness. The whispers began again, louder now, rising into a terrible chorus. I spun toward room 307, but Ethan was gone. The bed was empty. Mrs. Lewis's heart monitor in room 304 was flatlining. "What is happening?" I whispered. The man's footsteps echoed behind me. I ran toward the elevator, but when I reached it, the doors slammed shut. "You can't leave," the man's voice echoed. I turned toward the stairwell. I pushed through the door and sprinted down the steps. My headlamp beam bobbed wildly across the stained concrete walls. I reached the bottom floor and burst through the exit door, only to find myself standing in the same hallway on the third floor. "No," I gasped. I turned and saw the man standing at the end of the hallway. "You don't understand," he said, stepping toward me. "You're part of it now." I stumbled backward and crashed into a supply closet door. I threw it open and shut it behind me, locking it. Darkness surrounded me. My breathing was ragged. Click, 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 footsteps. "I know you're in there," the man's voice whispered from the other side of the door. I backed into the shelves, knocking over boxes of gloves and supplies. I pressed my hands over my mouth to keep from screaming. Then I heard Ethan's voice. "He's waking up." Suddenly, the lights in the closet exploded. Shards of glass showered down, and the door handle began to turn. The whispering rose into a deafening scream as the door opened. The door burst open and I screamed. My back hit the supply shelves as the pale figure in the doctor's coat stepped into the closet. His face was inches from mine, too close, and his cold, black eyes stared through me like I was nothing more than a specimen under glass. "You can't hide," he whispered. His breath smelled like rotting meat and chemicals. "You're already part of this." My hand shot out and grabbed a pair of scissors from the shelf. I swung them wildly, but they passed through him like smoke. The doctor smiled. "That's not going to work." Suddenly, the lights in the hall flickered back on. The man stepped backward, his form starting to blur and distort as the light grew brighter. I bolted out of the closet, racing down the hallway toward the stairwell. My heart was hammering so loudly I couldn't hear anything else. Not the screaming, not the whispers. The stairwell door flew open with a loud bang as I shoved through it, taking the steps 2 at a time. I reached the second floor and pushed through the exit door, and found myself back on the 3rd floor. No. The hallway was wrong now. The walls were warped and pulsing like they were breathing. The tiles beneath my feet were wet and sticky. I forced myself to look down and nearly threw up. The floor was covered in a slick, dark red substance. Blood. Down the hall, I saw room 304. Mrs. Lewis's heart monitor was still beeping, steadily, impossibly steady. A flatline rhythm, but the machine kept making noise. I stumbled toward the room. The lights buzzed and dimmed as I pushed open the door. Mrs. Lewis was sitting up in bed. Her head was bent at an unnatural angle, her mouth twisted into a horrible grin. Her milky white eyes stared at me. "You brought him back," she said in a soft, thin voice. "What are you talking about?" My voice shook. "You woke him up," she said, tilting her head further, the bones in her neck making a sickening pop. "You were never supposed to come here." Suddenly she lunged at me. Her thin, claw-like hands shot out and grabbed my wrist, her grip unnaturally strong. Her nails dug into my skin, drawing blood. I screamed and yanked free, stumbling back into the hall. The door slammed shut on its own, and I heard the sound of her laughing, a high, breathless giggle that made my skin crawl. I turned toward room 307. Ethan. If anyone knew what was happening, it was him. I ran down the hall, my shoes slipping on the blood-soaked floor. I shoved the door open, but the bed was empty. Ethan. From behind me, I heard a soft click, 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 the sound of polished shoes on tile. "He's not here," said a low voice. I spun around. The doctor stood in the doorway, his face half hidden in the shadows. His eyes gleamed. "You don't understand," he said. "You've opened the door." "What door?" I shouted. "What are you talking about?" The doctor stepped closer. His shadow stretched unnaturally across the floor, twisting and warping toward me. "Some places," he said, "are not meant to be disturbed." I backed away until my heel hit the edge of the bed. The doctor smiled. His teeth were unnaturally sharp. "You woke up something old," he whispered, "and now it's hungry." Suddenly the lights exploded in a shower of sparks. The room plunged into darkness. I heard the sound of footsteps, running. "Come on," Ethan's voice. A hand grabbed my arm. "Come on." I didn't hesitate. I ran with him down the hall. The lights were flickering wildly, casting twisted shadows across the walls. "What the hell is happening?" I shouted. ... "It's him," Ethan said breathlessly as we raced toward the stairwell. The doctor, he's not a person. He's something else. We burst through the stairwell door and started down. I don't understand, I said between gasps. Doc. Ethan yanked me to a stop halfway down the stairs. His face was pale, his dark eyes wide. He's not a ghost, Ethan said. Not exactly. He's old. Something that's been in this hospital since the beginning. And now that the hollow ward is open again, he's free. That doesn't make sense, I said. No, it doesn't, Ethan replied. But it's happening. A sudden loud crash from above made us both look up. The doctor was there, standing at the top of the stairs, his head tilted unnaturally to the side. His smile was so wide it split his face. Running won't save you, he said, back. We ran. The stairs twisted and warped beneath our feet. We reached the bottom, but the door that should have led to the lobby was gone. Just a smooth, cold wall of white tile. We're trapped, I said, my voice breaking. Ethan pressed his hands against the wall. No, he whispered. There has to be a way out. I told you, the doctor's voice said from the top of the stairs. You're part of this now. A low, rumbling sound filled the air. The tiles beneath our feet began to crack. From those cracks, dark tendrils. What is that? I shouted. Ethan pulled me toward the opposite wall. We have to go down. Down? The basement, Ethan said, his voice urgent. There's nothing down there. Yes, he said. That's the point. He grabbed my hand and we ran down the last flight of stairs. The door to the basement was rusted and warped. Ethan kicked it open and we stumbled into the dark. The walls down here were unfinished concrete, slick with moisture. Exposed pipes ran along the ceiling, dripping water. Keep moving, Ethan said, ... I followed him down the corridor. The sound of the doctor's footsteps echoed behind us. Click, click, click. You can't run, the doctor's voice whispered from the shadows. You belong to me now. We reached the end of the corridor. There was a steel door ahead, old and rusted. A heavy chain was looped through the handles. Help me, Ethan shouted, grabbing the chain. I pulled with him, my hands burning as the metal bit into my skin. Behind us, the darkness was moving. Tendrils of black smoke curled along the floor and ceiling. The doctor stepped out of the shadows, his form distorted and unnatural now. His limbs were too long, his face stretched into a terrible mockery of a human smile. You can't leave, he whispered. You're part of the ward now. The chain snapped. Ethan shoved open the door, and we fell through into a dark, empty room. The doctor's hand shot out, grabbing my wrist. Cold burned through my arm like acid. Ethan pulled me away, and I screamed as the doctor's hand slid down my arm, taking a piece of me with it. My skin was gray and cold where he'd touched me. The steel door slammed shut, ... We collapsed against the wall, gasping. What the hell was that? I said. Ethan shook his head. We have to destroy him, he said. It's the only way. Destroy him? I said. How the hell are we supposed to destroy that? Ethan's eyes were wide and dark. There's a reason the hollow ward was closed, he said. They tried to lock him away. How? I don't know, Ethan said, but we're going to find out. Suddenly the door began to rattle. The doctor's low voice echoed from the other side. You think you've escaped? He said softly. Oh, no, we're only just beginning. The steel door shook violently. the sound echoing through the dark basement. Bang, bang. The doctor's twisted voice seeped through the cracks in the door. "You can't hide from me," he whispered. "You don't belong out there anymore. You belong here with me." My arm still burned where he'd touched me. The skin was gray and numb, and it pulsed with a strange coldness that crept toward my shoulder. "We need to move," Ethan said, his voice sharp. I forced myself to stand, ignoring the deep ache in my legs. My eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light. The basement stretched out before us, a maze of concrete walls and rusted pipes. "We need to destroy him," I said. "But how the hell are we supposed to kill something that's not even alive?" "There's a reason the hollow ward was closed," Ethan said. "He was contained once. There has to be a way to do it again." A loud, scraping sound filled the air. My head whipped toward the source. "The archives?" Ethan said. "What?" "There's an old records room down here," Ethan explained, already moving toward a dark hallway. "If there's anything left that explains how they trapped him, it's going to be there." I followed him, the cold in my arm growing worse with every step. The hallway was narrow, the pipes above us dripping steadily onto the floor. The air was so damp it felt like I was breathing in water. Ethan stopped at a heavy wooden door. The paint was peeling, and it had deep gouges in the surface. "Help me," he said. We both shoved against it. After a moment of resistance, the door creaked open, releasing a blast of cold, stale air. The room beyond was cluttered with old filing cabinets and stacks of yellowed papers. Dust floated in the air, making it hard to breathe. Ethan started tearing through the cabinets. "Look for anything about patient experiments," he said, "or the ward being shut down." I stumbled toward a rusted metal desk and opened the top drawer. Inside was a stack of patient files. I flipped through them, my fingers shaking. "Patient number 302, severe schizophrenia, electroshock treatment. Patient number 217, insomnia, depression, lobotomy. Patient number 104, psychosis, restraint protocol." My stomach churned. This place wasn't just a hospital, it was a prison. "Found something," Ethan said. I turned. He held up a thin leather journal. The cover was stamped with a name, Dr. Richard Holloway. "The original head doctor," Ethan said. He flipped it open. Inside were faded handwritten entries. Ethan's eyes scanned the pages quickly. "Listen to this," he said. His voice was sharp with urgency. "We made a mistake. The patient in room 304, he's not human. He never was. The treatments didn't work because he wasn't sick. He was something else. We tried to isolate him, but the ward is feeding him now. The building itself is becoming part of him." We sealed the door, locked him inside the hollow ward. "But if it ever opens again, we won't be able to stop him." I felt sick. "Room 304, I whispered. "Mrs. Lewis's room." Ethan flipped further through the pages. "There's only one way to stop him." "What is it?" I asked. "Fire." My eyes widened. "Fire?" "It makes sense," Ethan said. "They didn't shut the hospital down because of bad press or poor treatment. They shut it down because they were trying to burn him out." "But they failed," I said. "Because they didn't finish the job," Ethan replied. A sudden loud crash from the hallway made us both jump. I turned toward the door and froze. The doctor was standing there, his smile stretched impossibly wide. His arms were too long now, the flesh hanging unnaturally from his bones. "I warned you," he whispered. I stumbled back. The papers in my hands scattered to the floor. "You can't stop me," the doctor said softly. "You've already let me out." Dark tendrils of smoke curled out from beneath his feet, crawling across the floor toward us. Ethan grabbed my hand. "Run." We bolted toward the back of the room, climbing over fallen filing cabinets and broken desks. The tendrils followed us, curling around Ethan's ankle. He stumbled, falling to the floor. "No." I grabbed his arm and yanked hard. The tendrils were dragging him backward, dark smoke curling around his legs. The doctor's smile widened. His teeth gleamed unnaturally white. "You can't take him," I snarled. I pulled Ethan free, and we stumbled toward the back wall. A small maintenance door was half buried beneath a pile of old chairs. Ethan shoved them aside and pulled the door open. We dove through, landing hard on the concrete floor beyond. Ethan slammed the door shut behind us, locking it with a rusted bolt. Panting, we looked around. We were in the boiler room. "I think we just found our solution," Ethan said. I followed his gaze. The room was filled with old gas lines and a massive furnace. Rusted pipes twisted along the ceiling like veins. "We're going to burn him out," Ethan said. I shook my head. "If we light this place up, we might not make it out." Ethan's face was pale and determined. "It's the only way," he said. I swallowed hard, then nodded. The floor above us creaked. The doctor's voice echoed through the pipes. "You're not leaving," he whispered. Ethan moved toward the furnace, wrenching open a rusted gas valve. A thin hiss filled the room as the air grew heavier. "Now," Ethan shouted. I grabbed a box of matches from a shelf and struck one. The tiny flame flickered and danced. "You'll burn with me," the doctor's voice hissed. The tendrils of smoke were already curling under the door. I looked at Ethan. His dark eyes were steady. "Do it," he said. I threw the match. Bah! There was a moment of absolute silence, and then the room exploded. Fire erupted along the pipes, climbing the walls. The ceiling cracked and groaned as the flames spread. The dark tendrils recoiled and screamed, twisting as the fire engulfed them. The doctor's voice howled through the air, an inhuman scream of rage and pain. "Go!" Ethan shouted, grabbing my hand. We ran toward the exit, smoke filling the air. The hallway beyond was already burning. We sprinted toward the stairwell, my lungs screaming for air. Behind us, the building groaned and shuddered. The fire was spreading too fast. We burst into the lobby. The glass doors were cracked from the heat, but they held. "Almost there," Ethan yelled. Suddenly, the doctor's shape emerged from the fire. His face was melting, his body blackened and burned, but he was still moving. "You can't kill me," he hissed. I grabbed a metal chair and hurled it at the glass door. It shattered. Ethan and I dove through the opening, just as the ceiling collapsed behind us. We hit the cold pavement outside, gasping. Flames erupted from the windows of the hollow ward, black smoke curling into the night sky. The doctor's face flickered in the fire for one last moment, then vanished. We lay there, breathing hard as the fire roared. After a moment, Ethan turned toward me. "You okay?" "No," I said. "You?" "Not even close." We both started laughing. Hysterical, exhausted laughter. In the distance, I heard the sound of sirens. "I think it's over," I said. Ethan's eyes were dark. "I hope so," he said. As the fire consumed the hollow ward, I couldn't help but wonder, had we destroyed him, or had we simply set him free? The Lost Ship. I've been on salvage missions for 10 years now, but I've never seen anything like this. It started with a distress signal, a weak, pulsing transmission picked up by the Coast Guard, an old maritime emergency code that hadn't been used in over 50 years. The source? Somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, far beyond the usual shipping routes. The ship's registry identified it as the Calliope, a cargo vessel that had gone missing in 1972. Its entire crew had vanished without a trace. My team was called in to investigate standard protocol. We'd salvaged sunken tankers, oil rigs, even crashed military submarines before. Haunted ships were just stories, sailors' superstitions, right? There were 5 of us on board the Corvus, our salvage ship. Captain Harris, the hard-ass leader who never let emotion cloud his judgment. Nick, our engineer and walking encyclopedia of naval history. Jade, the medic and Harris's closest confidant. Mark, our quiet but skilled sonar operator. And me, Olivia, lead recovery diver. It took 2 days of rough sailing to reach the coordinates. When the radar first picked it up, we thought it was a mistake. A ship shouldn't have been there, not that far from any trade routes. "Got a visual," Mark called from the monitor. We crowded around the screen, and there it was, the Calliope. It drifted silently in the water, partially shrouded in fog, the moonlight casting long shadows across its rusted hull. The ship was massive, much larger than we expected. The exterior was corroded, covered in patches of algae and barnacles. Yet it didn't look like it had been sinking. It was intact. Captain Harris narrowed his eyes. "It should have gone down decades ago," he muttered. ... I suited up for the dive with Nick, while Harris stayed on the bridge to monitor us. As the dinghy approached the side of the ship, I could feel the temperature drop. The air around the Calliope was cold. Not normal cold, a sharp, unnatural chill that made my breath fog in the night air. Nick tied the dinghy to a corroded ladder. I went up first, my gloved hands scraping against the rusted metal as I climbed. My flashlight beam flicked across the deck, revealing chipped paint, shattered glass, and old lifeboats that were still intact but hanging loose from their hooks. "This is seriously messed up," Nick said as he pulled himself over the railing. We made our way toward the bridge. The silence was oppressive. No creaking metal, no echo of waves against the hull, just our breathing. Inside the bridge, the controls were intact, but covered in a thick layer of grime. Mold and algae grew in patches across the walls. A logbook sat open on the captain's table. I picked it up and dusted off the cover. "What does it say?" Nick asked. I squinted at the brittle pages, the ink barely legible. Final entry dated November 3rd, 1972. Crew distressed. Strange noises below deck. Navigational equipment failing. Unseen figure spotted near the engine room. Emergency signal set. "If this reaches anyone, stay away." Nick let out a slow breath. "Yeah, that's comforting." A loud clang echoed from the corridor behind us. We both jumped. "What the hell was that?" I whispered. Nick pulled out his flashlight. "Maybe something's loose." I shined my beam down the hall. Nothing. just rows of empty doors and peeling paint. We split up to investigate. I checked the rooms one by one, finding only signs of abandonment. Old uniforms, corroded medical equipment, empty bunks. That's when I heard it. A faint sound beneath my feet. Tapping. A steady, rhythmic tapping. "Nick?" I called out. "Over here." His voice echoed from the opposite side of the hallway. I followed the sound of his light, but then the tapping grew louder. It was coming from beneath the floor. Bang, 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 bang. The metal beneath my feet bulged. What the hell? Suddenly the floor buckled beneath me. My legs slipped through the rusted metal, and my knee hit something hard below. I screamed, pain shooting through my leg. "Olivia!" Nick's hands were under my arms, hauling me up. I coughed, clutching my leg. I'm fine. Nick shone his light through the hole where I'd fallen, and we both saw it. A hand. Thin, gray, clawed fingers were pressed against the underside of the metal, and then tap, 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 dot, dot. The fingers twitched. "Get up," Nick shouted. We ran back toward the deck. The ship suddenly felt alive. The air was heavier, and I swear the walls were closing in. Captain Harris's voice crackled over the radio. "Olivia! Nick! Report! We need to get off this ship," I screamed. We reached the deck, but the dinghy was gone. What the neck spun around. Where is it? The rope's cut. Panic settled in. We were stranded. We turned toward the side of the ship and saw Jade standing at the railing. "Jade!" Nick yelled. She didn't answer. She just stood there, facing the water. Nick ran toward her. "Hey, what the hell are you?" Jade turned. Her eyes were black. She smiled. Then she stepped backward and disappeared over the side. "No!" Nick lunged forward, but I held him back. A low, vibrating hum began resonating through the ship, deep and guttural. From below deck, footsteps began echoing. Too many for just a few people. A deep voice cut through the noise, hollow and unnatural. "You came for us. Now you belong to us." Nick and I backed toward the edge of the ship. I could feel the hum vibrating through the metal beneath my feet. Then the fog parted, and I saw them, figures rising out of the water, pale gray skin, sunken eyes, and black mouths stretched too wide. They were climbing up the side of the ship. Nick's hand closed around my arm. "What do we do?" "We fight," I said, my heart hammering. The first pair of hands gripped the railing. Then they climbed on board, and we realized the Calliope hadn't been abandoned. It had just been waiting. Nick and I stood frozen as the creatures hauled themselves over the side of the ship. Their gray, bloated skin glistened in the moonlight. Long, clawed fingers dragging across the corroded metal of the deck. Their eyes, hollow and sunken, glowed faintly like dying embers. And their mouths stretched too wide, black voids where teeth should have been. Nick tightened his grip on my arm. "What the hell are those things?" I couldn't answer because part of me already knew. Jade had vanished over the side, but now I saw her again, standing at the far end of the deck. Water dripped from her hair and uniform and her eyes. Her eyes were still black. "Jade?" Nick whispered. She smiled, wide and unnatural, then began walking toward us, her bare feet slapping weightily against the deck. Behind her, the other figures followed, dragging themselves upright with jerky, broken movements. Some wore tattered clothes. remnants of crew uniforms. Others were nearly naked, their bodies scarred and covered in dark lesions. "Back up," I said, pulling Nick toward the edge of the ship. "They're cutting us off," he hissed. He was right. The creatures were spreading out, moving to surround us. "We can't fight them all," I said. Nick's eyes darted toward the side of the ship. "We have to jump." "Into the water?" I glanced over the edge. The waves beneath us churned unnaturally, black and restless. "What other choice do we have?" A long, clawed hand shot toward Nick's ankle. I swung the crowbar from my tool belt. It connected with a sickening crack. The creature's arm bent backward at an impossible angle, but it didn't scream. It didn't even flinch. It just stared at me, its black eyes glittering like oil beneath the moonlight. Nick grabbed my hand. "Jump." We climbed the railing and hurled ourselves over the side. The water was freezing. The shock of it nearly stopped my heart. We surfaced, gasping, and I instinctively reached for Nick. His hand found mine, but the current was strong, dragging us toward the hull of the ship. I glanced up and saw the creatures leaning over the railing, watching us. Their mouths stretched open, and then they began screaming. The sound was deafening, an unearthly, wailing chorus that reverberated through the water and shook my skull. My vision blurred from the pressure. "They're going to pull us under," Nick shouted. I kicked toward the side of the ship, searching for the rope ladder we'd climbed earlier, but it was gone. Cut. "Olivia." Nick's hand slipped from mine. I turned and saw a pair of gray, clawed hands closing around his ankle. "No," Nick thrashed, his face wild with panic as he was yanked beneath the surface. Without thinking, I dove down after him. Beneath the surface, the water was unnaturally dark. I strained to see him, and then I spotted him, just a few feet below. A creature had him, its long fingers curled around his ankle, dragging him down. Nick was struggling, kicking, but the creature's grip was unyielding. I swam harder, heart hammering, and reached toward him. My fingers brushed his. A second pair of hands closed around my waist and yanked me backward. I screamed, bubbles escaping from my mouth as I was dragged deeper. I fought against the iron grip, kicking wildly. My flashlight, still strapped to my wrist, cut a pale beam through the dark water, and that's when I saw it. Dozens of them, floating in the depths below. Hundreds of gray figures, their bodies drifting lazily in the dark water. Their faces were blank, but their black eyes tracked my every movement. Nick twisted in the creature's grip, kicking hard enough to dislodge it. His hand shot toward me. I grabbed it, and together we propelled upward. The surface exploded around us as we broke through. I coughed and gasped for breath, clutching Nick's arm as he choked out seawater. Above us, the creatures were still screaming. We swam toward the rear of the ship, and that's when we saw the lifeboat. It was still attached, swaying precariously from the davits. Nick pointed toward it. "There, we can climb it." We reached the rope ladder beneath the lifeboat. Nick hoisted himself up first, then reached down to help me. As I climbed over the edge of the lifeboat, a sharp sound filled the air. A long metallic creak from somewhere deep in the hull. The ship was sinking. I could feel the vibration through the floor of the lifeboat, a low, resonating groan like metal under immense pressure. "That's not normal," Nick said. I scanned the deck. Jade was still there, her face pale beneath the moonlight. But her eyes were different now, and she was smiling, Olivia. Nick's voice was shaking. Jade raised her hand slowly, and then she pointed downward. I followed her gaze toward the water beneath us. Shapes were moving beneath the surface, dark shapes, massive shapes. Then the lifeboat started to sink. "Get out," Nick shouted. I scrambled toward the edge, but the rope was already being pulled under. A pale hand shot out of the water and gripped the side of the lifeboat. Then another, and another. Jesus Christ. The hands began dragging the lifeboat down. The water was up to my knees, then my waist. Nick grabbed me, hauling me toward the edge. "Jump." I hesitated, and that's when the first face rose from the water. It was a woman, her features pale and swollen, her hair floating like seaweed around her face. Her mouth stretched wide as her black eyes locked on me, ... "Join us," she whispered. Nick shoved me over the side. I hit the water hard, struggling to the surface as Nick followed. The lifeboat disappeared beneath the waves, swallowed whole. I swam toward the ship. "We have to get back on board." Nick hesitated. "Are you crazy?" "We don't have a choice." We reached a dangling mooring line and climbed, hand over hand, back onto the deck. The creatures were gone. The fog had thickened again, swallowing the horizon. Nick leaned against the railing, his breath ragged. "What now?" "Roar." My eyes drifted toward the entrance to the lower decks. The metal hatch was still ajar. "I think..." My pulse hammered in my ears. "I think the ship is sinking because of them." Nick frowned. "So what do? "We find out why it's still afloat." "You mean..." "I think whatever's keeping this ship above water is down there." Nick's eyes darkened. "You want to go deeper?" "If we don't," I said, "we're not getting off this ship." Nick's jaw tightened. He nodded slowly. We picked up the crowbars from the deck and made our way toward the entrance. Before I stepped through, I looked back toward the fog-shrouded ocean. I could still see Jade standing at the edge of the ship, her hands resting on the railing, her lips parted. "Bye." Her mouth didn't move, but I heard her voice in my head. "Come down below, Olivia. We've been waiting for you." Nick and I descended the metal staircase into the heart of the ship. My breath echoed in the narrow steel corridor, each step down bringing with it a growing sense of pressure, like the weight of the entire ocean was bearing down on us. Nick walked ahead of me, flashlight in one hand, crowbar in the other. His knuckles were white from how hard he was gripping it. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the fear he was trying to suppress. The deeper we went, the colder the air became. My breath came out in visible puffs, and moisture dripped down the metal walls, forming dark, rusted streaks. The air reeked of salt and rot. "I don't like this," Nick muttered, ... I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mind kept replaying what Jade had said. Come down below. The lower levels of the ship were nearly pitch black. The emergency lights along the ceiling flickered erratically, casting jagged shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. ... We passed a series of open doors. Inside each one were empty bunks, personal belongings still strewn across the floor, as though the crew had left in a hurry. And the further we went, the worse the damage became. Furniture lay overturned. Deep gouges marred the metal walls, long, jagged scratches. "Jesus," Nick whispered. He knelt down, shining his flashlight over one of the walls. What the hell made these? I stepped closer. The scratch marks were deep, too deep to have been made by any tool or weapon I knew of. That's not the worst part, Nick said, Dot. I followed his gaze to the floor. There, beneath the scratches, was something I hadn't seen before. A dark, crusted substance. Blood. I think the crew fought back, Nick said. His voice was low, steady, but beneath it I could hear the fear. And they lost, I said. A noise came from up ahead. A faint tapping sound. Nick and I froze. The sound was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking on a hollow door. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the engine room. Nick raised his crowbar. Do we go in? We don't have a choice. We pushed through the heavy steel door. The engine room was massive. Pipes and machinery stretched up into the shadows above us, illuminated only by the dim emergency lights. A low hum filled the air, the sound of the ship's dying heartbeat. There's no way this ship is still operational, Nick whispered. How is it still afloat? I didn't know, but I was beginning to suspect that something was keeping it afloat, something not mechanical. A sudden chill swept through the room, and then the noise came again, not tapping this time. Footsteps, slow, deliberate. Nick, Bot. A figure stepped out from behind the machinery. It was Jade. Her hospital uniform was soaked with seawater, her skin pallid and glistening, her black eyes locked on mine. Olivia, she whispered, come closer. My heart pounded. I took a step back, but Nick didn't move. Nick? Nick? I grabbed his arm. He was staring at her, his mouth slightly open, eyes distant. Nick, I shouted. But Jade was smiling now. He's already heard the call, she whispered. Just like I did. Nick's hand loosened around the crowbar. Nick! I yanked him backward, hard. His eyes fluttered, confusion crossing his face. What? Jade's smile widened unnaturally. Don't fight it, Olivia. You don't have to run anymore. Stay back, I shouted. Jade tilted her head. But why would you want to leave? You belong here now. Nick. The emergency lights flickered violently, and then the shadows came to life. Figures emerged from the darkness. The crew. The men we'd seen before. Their faces were bloated and pale, their eyes black and shining like oil. They moved with unnatural grace, slipping between the pipes and machinery. We've been waiting for you, Jade whispered. Nick's grip tightened on my arm. We need to get out of here, he said. But the crew were closing in from all sides. There was no way out. Jade stepped forward, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the metal floor. You could stay with us forever, she said softly. No more fear, no more pain. Behind her, a massive shape shifted in the shadows. It was huge, dark, barely human. A figure with too many limbs, its massive body unfurling from the machinery. Glowing white eyes opened in the dark. What the hell is that? Nick's breath. Jade's head slowly turned toward the creature. Our captain, she whispered. He's been waiting for you too. The thing's eyes pulsed like heartbeats, and then it moved. Tentacles shot toward us. Nick and I dove aside as the steel pipes buckled and twisted under the impact. Run. We sprinted toward the exit, but the crew were waiting there. A pair of cold hands grabbed my arm. I screamed, wrenching free. Nick swung the crowbar, cracking it across one of their skulls, but the figure barely reacted. We can't fight them," he shouted. "Then what do we do?" I saw it then, a rusted wheel on the wall near the back of the engine room. It was marked floodgate release. "We have to sink the ship." Nick's eyes widened. "Are you insane? If we don't stop this, they'll pull us under." The massive creature was moving now, unfurling itself from the machinery, its limbs stretching unnaturally across the ceiling. Nick grabbed the wheel. This better work. He turned it. A low groan echoed through the ship as the floodgates released. Water surged through the lower corridors. The crew stumbled backward as the tide filled the room. Jade screamed, a high, unearthly sound. Her body contorted, her limbs snapping unnaturally as the water swallowed her whole dot. Nick grabbed my hand. "Come on." We climbed the ladder toward the deck as the water rose behind us. The creature's massive limbs thrashed through the machinery, but it was too late. The ship was dying. We burst onto the deck. The lifeboat had resurfaced, half submerged but still intact. We climbed aboard as the ship groaned beneath us. The deck tilted sharply, then collapsed inward. Metal screamed as the hull tore open. The ship slipped beneath the waves. Jade's face was the last thing I saw, her black eyes staring up from beneath the water. Her lips moved soundlessly. "We'll find you." Then the ocean swallowed her whole. Nick and I floated for hours. The sun rose, cutting through the fog, and eventually we saw a ship on the horizon, ... The Coast Guard. They pulled us from the water, wrapping us in blankets. When the officer asked what happened, I didn't know what to say. "A storm," I whispered. "We got caught in a storm." Nick looked at me, but he didn't contradict me. I couldn't tell them the truth, because I knew, even though we'd escaped that ship, we weren't safe. Even now, sometimes I hear the sound of the ocean calling to me ... And when I close my eyes at night, I see Jade's face beneath the water, and those black eyes staring back at me, because I know the truth. That ship didn't sink. It's still out there, waiting for its next crew.